Shalom, everyone. Welcome to Wednesday night. It's going to be a interesting night because I think I'm going to finish. I'm not going to finish anything. I never do. I give you more than you probably ever would want to know at one time. But this time I gave you notes ahead of time. If you've got your notes, that will help. I also made a few slides just for those who don't have notes to to help you understand some of the intricacies. Now, we've talked about the Merkava, the holy chariot. We've talked about the um, tree of life and all of the sephirot and all of the things that go with it. I'm going to try to combine them tonight because this lesson kind of lends itself to that so that you get the end. I want you to gain an understanding of what it is exactly Kabbalah is about. It's not just simply prophecy. There's more to it. It's about redemption. It's about families. It's about the Sabbath. It's a great deal of things, and I want to make sure that we're all at least looking at it from that same kind of perspective. So the topic for tonight, or I gained my topic from that first verse of chapter 6 when I begin by talking about from the Copper Mountains to the ends of the earth. So we're going to talk about Zechariah's final prophecy. And it's not his final prophecy, but it's his final of these six. So we're in the sixth chapter, and let's look at that first verse together. It begins out by saying, "Once again, I raised my eyes and saw." Notice it's once again. The understanding is the fact that he's lifting his eyes because the visions are coming from above. He's now in the midst of seeing, this is the sixth vision that he's having at this particular point in time. And they've been coming one right after another. And so as we're looking at this, understand that what he saw was, behold, four chariots were emerging from between two mountains. The mountains were mountains of copper. They were mountains of copper. So we're looking at four chariots coming. And a chariot, remember, is in Hebrew is the word Merkava. Merkava. It's also the same word that they use for their Hebrew tanks. They were called chariots in the beginning, and so they therefore became Merkava. And so the tank is an example. But it was a special kind of, well, I don't know how to put it. We're going to look at judgment, or the beginning of a judgment. So as we're going through this, I want you to begin to understand it. Now, this chapter is really the culmination of the six. And so what we're going to be talking about really started in chapter 1. So I want you to flip back to chapter 1 for a second. And we're going to look at there. We're going to look at verse number 7. Yes, look at verse number 7. Look at verse number 8. Here's the beginning of this first vision. I saw a vision in the night. There was a man riding a red horse, and he was standing among the myrtle bushes that were in a pool of water. And behind him were horses of red, sorrel, and white. And I said, What are these, my Lord? And the angel who was speaking to me said to me, I will show you what these are. And the man who was standing up among the myrtles spoke up and said, These are the ones who Hashem has sent to travel upon the earth. So in the beginning, his first vision began with horses. Now this sixth vision begins with horses. The difference between the first and the second, as you can see, the first one, the rider was standing in a pool of water. There was no chariot. It was just the rider. So we're beginning to look at a vision that starts differently, and it's on purpose. And notice the use of color. Color becomes very important when we begin to talk about prophetic writings. So we are made to be aware that these are not the same horses. Well, maybe they are. You see, they're the same color, red, black, white, and the other one's called dapple. Now, in chapter 1, they simply, well, they were wandering the earth more than anything else. But it's not till the 6th chapter that all of a sudden they are eager to go. And so they come flying out from between two copper mountains towards Zechariah. Now, Zechariah sees these 4 chariots coming out from between these copper mountains, and the angelic interpreter explains that these chariots are actually 4 spirits of the heavens, and they were sent by God to patrol the earth. Now, these creatures leave their place with God and pass through a pass between the 2 copper mountains. But we understand, if you remember correctly, copper was a substance of strength, and it's also a substance of judgment. So we're going to begin to look at these 2 mountains are judgment. The horses are no longer just horses wandering. These are now tied to chariots. So we get the idea that there's going to be a war or some kind of involvement that way. Now these seem to be more of an esoteric gates where they runs between the two mountains. It's the mountains themselves are going to be representing heaven and earth. They're going to represent that which is a gateway, if you will. Now, the dual mountains may echo the twin aspects of divine guidance or governance. You see, whenever we start talking about judgment, we have to talk about Hesed and Din. Hesed means mercy. Hesed means loving kindness. Din, on the other hand, means judgment. So they're coming from somewhere between heaven and earth, and they're coming with this idea of mercy and judgment. So it depends on the lens that we're going to be using as to what's going to happen next. Now, the Copper Mountains, well, they're likely dealing with just the idea of strength and immovable, perhaps representing the unshakable presence of God's judgments that are about to happen. Now, this vision reinforces the idea that God's Spirit is actively at work in our world today, and ensuring that, well, his presence and his word is carried out. So sending out of these chariots parallels God's command over all the nations, and he's executing judgment upon the wicked, which is apparently what's going to happen, although we haven't got to that point yet. So we're bringing about, or the horses will eventually bring about peace, but it will come at a terrible price. Now, we're not given a reason for the color of the horses. Some simply take them back to the Daniel vision. Remember where Daniel was dealing with the Babylon and Media Persia and Greece and Rome, and he was dealing with the statue, and it was made out of gold, and it was made out of silver, and it was made out of brass, and it was made out of iron. The same idea holds true here. Maybe that's what he was thinking. Others simply hold the idea that he's talking about not those 4, but he may be talking about what I saw in Daniel 7 when we studied Daniel 7, the fact that these characters were actually different. There was a lion and an eagle, which represented Great Britain and the United States, but then there was also the animal of the bear, which represented Russia, and the 4 leopard heads, which represented the 4 German empires, and finally the 10-headed monster that was going to be here at the end of days. Now, the chariots play an important, well, at least I should say, a significant fundamental role in shaping ancient warfare, providing much of the speed and the tactile versatility that they express. Now, psychologically, these horses with chariots were domineering. And from the battlefields of Mesopotamia all the way through Egypt and China and all of the other places, they represented a step up in the strategy of war. Although eventually they're going to be supplanted by just simply the cavalry, it's technologically and strategically advantaged to them to have these instruments or have these horses, as you will, or these chariots. Now, in ancient times, the Merkava chariot appeared to require a team of either 2 or 4 horses, giving the rider a feeling of importance and speed. I don't know if you ever used to watch the movie Ben-Hur. Ben-Hur, there were always teams of 4 horses. Now, according to one of the emperors of Rome, he needed a team of 20 horses in front of his chariot. I don't know how he managed to control all 20, but that was part of his understanding. So it was time, and we're going to be talking about a time of execution, divine judgments about to happen. Now, the Merkava is one of the most powerful and, well, it's multi-layered symbols in all Jewish mysticism and prophetic traditions. Today, to understand it is to stand at the intersection between prophecy, mysticism, and actually the cosmic order and the divine human relationship. The Merkava is God's prophetic vehicle. The chariot represents the means by which God's will is revealed to the world. Now, in Ezekiel, it's the form through which divine presence becomes visible. In other words, when we look at Ezekiel chapter 1, that's the first time that we actually read about the Merkava. Elijah went to heaven in a fiery chariot, which some people will call the Merkava. But the first time that we really see this creature, because it was alive as well as being a machine, and so it moves through. It has a cosmic order to it. It's got wheels within wheels, and it has multiple faces on the driver, and it represents spiritual intelligence and angelic forces in perfect harmony with God's will. Now, it was somewhere in the first to 6th centuries BC or CE that the Merkava became the central symbol of all the mystical ascents of the soul. Mystics known as, well, they were called Yordi Merkava, descenders into the chariots, sought to ascend through the spiritual realms to perceive the God's throne. This was not merely a vision, but it was a dangerous, actually, journey for many of them because it required that they must be pure. It required them to have a great deal of knowledge about the names of the angels. Now, I often show you the chart of the 10 Sephirot. On the other side of the chart, there's more charts. One of them deals with not only the name of the sphere, but it also gives you the name of the angel that you had to deal with when you went through that sphere. So you called upon you to know where you were at and who you were going to be facing. Now, it's in that vein that Rabbi Akiva, if you remember him, led 4 other rabbis through these various realms up into paradise. Now, they didn't meet God while they were in paradise, but they made this long journey. Now, one of the problems with that long journey was the fact that once they arrived, they were not supposed to look at the water that's there because it wasn't water and call it water. Well, several did. One of them became insane. Another one refused to return home. A third one became an atheist. So there was a lot of changes that occurred because of the way they looked at what was going on in paradise. Now, in Kabbalah, the Merkava is seen as a structure of emanations. It's the Sephirot, arranged in a dynamic motion, especially in the form of a tree. because this is the motion that we're talking about. They call it a living tree or the tree of life. God's chariot becomes a symbol of how divine energy flows from, well, the infinite, also known as the Ein Sof, the incomprehensible one, through these Sephiroth worlds all the way up to the top. Now, in Ezekiel 1, we're shown a key symbolic, well, a symbol of elements. And I want to take time and see if I can get this up. Where is it? I'm not, okay, here I am. Forgive me, we're going to do this again. I want us to take a look at this. I've made several of these so that you can actually see it. And I want to talk you through them because it really is important to understand what's going on. So we start out with what, again, we think of as the Merkava. Now, the one in Ezekiel, when you look at Ezekiel's Merkava, oops, I just went too quick. When you look at Ezekiel's Merkava, here we go. You have a man sitting on a throne. The assumption is by most that that is God. The rabbis will tell you that might not be God at all, but another character, either the Metron or the character that would be known later as Ezekiel, having gone through what is amounts to a series of changes in his own being as he moves up through the ladder. We have four living creatures that were attached to this. We have the eagle, we have the lion with the eagle's wings, we have the leopard, and we have the cow. All of these represent different portions, different characters that we find in the 12 disciples or 12 tribes. The wheels themselves were full of eyes, and they worked together, and they were interconnected. And so the whole thing was going to be something quite different. Now, these four creatures that I begin to talk about come from the realm of the wild, which is the lion. The ox was the domesticated being. We also talk about the eagle being from the sky, and finally man, who gives us reason. So within the wheels, there's an interconnection with divine processes. In other words, the idea of being able to see the world from a point of view other than this earth. Now, the divine light radiated from this Merkava. And finally, the throne and the man-like figure that was inside later should be called, if nothing else, Tetzlim Elohim. In other words, the shadow of a god, because that's who he was supposed to be. Now, we're going to talk about horses. So in chapter 1, remember, we started out, we read that little short blip of the horses. That's important because we're at this point in time in chapter 1, they weren't doing anything, they were passive. They were scouting, if nothing else. But the chariots here in chapter 6, remember, they were active. They came rushing out from between the two mountains. We talk about four winds in chapter 2, which is a symbol of dispersion. In other words, the nations were dispersed, or Israel was dispersed in the beginning. Now the divine agents are returning with this purpose of putting things back together again. In chapter 3, there was the story of the branch. That's a future promise. That's what's coming at the end of days. But right now it's crowned, it's a ritual preview of what's going to happen. And finally, in chapter 2, I skipped that. That was the measuring line where there were preparations for rebuilding or reestablishing the temple and all that's going on. Right now, there's a lot of conversation in Israel about the rebuilding of the temple. If you've been watching, you notice that the last few weeks that the Jews have been allowed to go up and pray and sing and dance on the mountain, which is far from where it was before. But it appears as though the defeat of the uh, Iranians has changed the temperament of everyone that's there. Now, I want to link it to the images that are going on before me. So I have two columns. One's the Merkava, which is on the middle column, and then the other one's the Yetzheim, the tree of life. Now, the origin of the Merkava is a prophetic origin. And again, it goes back to Ezekiel chapter 1. But when you talk about the tree of life, you're talking about a system of understanding. So we're getting into the point now where we're not only talking about, well, the idea of what it looks like, but we're also talking about the idea of what it's about. Now, there's a form which goes on. The Merkava is about the form, about a throne and living creatures and wheels and fire and a vehicle. While the 10 Sephirot is a structure. And besides the structure, there are 22 letters that fill in the gaps between these, so that there are 32 paths for understanding. Now, normally our goal is to go from Malkut to Keter, to the crown. To get there, we go through several paths. There are several ways to get there. Each way is different, and it's based upon our abilities. Some of us, well, some of us are headstrong, and we need to go different ways in order to get there. Others are more passive, if you will. But any way you look at it, the direction, if you're in a Merkava, is horizontal. It's moving north, south, east, and west. But the eventual direction is towards the north, towards the sky. In the case of this, it's all about going up. It's about vertical climbs. Now, the spiritual function, the vehicle of God's presence, the Merkava, it's for mystical ascent. Now, the map of divine emanations and the soul's alignment, well, that's for a different purpose altogether. Finally, the last one are the colors of the horses. Now, we've read them and we're going to go back through them again, but I want you to know that those horses have a specific color, and the color has a symbological meaning. And also, it's for biblical and mystical association. We're going to associate some colors with some things. So when we talk about red, the Hebrew word for red is Adam. And red oftentimes is seen as war, it's seen as bloodshed or some sort of divine anger. Now, biblically, red reminds you of the character called Esau. Also, because of the fact that this structure deals also with the cosmic signs, it also deals with Mars. Mars is the red planet. And it also deals with Gevarah, the idea of severity. The black is Shakor. Shakor usually speaks of famine. It speaks of mourning. It speaks of judgment. So darkness in the plagues is what we see in Lamentations, those kinds of things. It's a restraint, but it's not pleasant. White, on the other hand, is Lavan, which deals with purity and mercy and victory. Those are the colors that, well, the white's the color that you wear on Yom Kippur. It deals with the idea of hesed, of kindness, and again, of clarity. But then you have those horses that are dappled or mottled. And those are horses with, well, their forces are mixed. They're unstable. They're complex, but they're unstable. Jacob's sheep had a duality to them like that. They were morally ambiguous, but at the same time, they were exiles. They were not the kind that you wanted. Now, there's going to be a word that's going to be used towards the end, and it's called the strong horses, which doesn't really have a word for it as I would look for here, but it indicates extra power or divine urgency. And it even suggests the idea of dominance in this whole process. So, anyway, so this is what we're talking about. Now, for those who've already got, I gave you my copy of my lesson. You've got these charts to work with. And so you should be able to go back and use them. I'm still going to talk about them again and again and again in order to become part of the vocabulary that you're going to be developing. Because the vocabulary of a Kabbalist is not the vocabulary of a Christian. It's not anywhere close to that. These people began to look at the word from a very, very deep spiritual point. Oftentimes it was seen as something that, well, until Bel Shem Tov, Gentiles were never supposed to ever hear this stuff. It was not to be taught. But again, with Bel Shem Tov, time began to change. Not only did time begin to change, but so did the understanding of where we were in time. They began to see time as we are moving into the end of days. There were several characters in the period of time that we're talking about. The Vilna Gaon tried twice to move from Lithuania down to Jerusalem because he knew it was the time, and this was in the 1600s, he knew it was time to go home. He could not get there, but he sent his people down there, and the Jewish quarter was established because the Vilna sent them down there. So we began to see the end coming hundreds of years before, not what we normally think of. So when we look at time, our understanding is far different than God's. So I want you to begin to build upon that idea that we're moving closer towards the end of days. Doesn't mean tomorrow it will. We're just moving closer to it at this particular point in time. Okay. So let me get a drink of water. So Zechariah is reinforcing all of these visions that he's had in these previous weeks. And it's about developing and escalating. He begins with one, then he begins to add to it. That's the way the process works with him. So keep that in mind. Now, at the basic level, the Merkava was simply a chariot. It was a vehicle for transporting a king or a warrior. But in prophetic literature, it's also the heavenly vehicle by which God reveals his presence and moves through creation. There are only two main prophetic sources for the Merkava. The first one is in Ezekiel. The second one is here. This is it. The rest of it is built upon other books. We normally want to say that the Bible is the total answer. That's not true in the case of the Jews and their understanding of where you're going to have to go for more and more information. The Bible is complete. Well, it's actually completely incomplete. There's many events that are not spoken. There are many events that are actually out of time, out of place, out of position. There's going to be a character called Rabbi Akiva who's going to die, who's going to be one of the 10 martyrs who will die because of the sins of Joseph when he fled from the house of Potiphar and left behind his garment with 10 semen stains on it. So he had to be punished. It wasn't until the days of Nero that he began to call that into being. But again, 10 rabbis had to die. The problem? The 10 that died are not all in the same generation. So we have to understand chronology is not going to be a perfect answer for everything here. Here in Zechariah 6, we are introduced to these 4 chariots, and these chariots emerge from between the copper, and they deal with the 4 winds, the spirits of heaven, divine agents or judgments that are going to be passed down. Now, these chariots represent how God's will is going to be revealed to the world. In Ezekiel, it is a form through which his divine presence becomes visible without fully being seen. Hard to imagine. We know war is brought about because of conflicts between people, but how often do we not associate them with judgments that are going on? God establishing or causing things to happen. Now, there's several key elements that go along with this, which I gave you in those charts. So as we've been looking at these chapters in Zechariah, I've kind of been I've been splitting between God's chariot and the tree of life, trying to make the comparisons to the divine chariot and to the tree, and give you an open understanding of some really deep insights into the structures. There's no way I can give you all of the answers to all the questions, but I can give you more than what we've had before, because I am not able to get all the answers that I need. But again, we have to go back and understand how do Jews learn. Well, in order to learn, you have to have 3 things. You have to have a teacher, you have to have a student, and you have to have a Torah. Those 3 together are inseparable. But eventually the teacher, well, he's taught all that he can, and the student becomes needing finding a student for himself so he might teach. And the process continues on and on and on and on. The idea is that you today, even you, have enough information that you can give to others to help them move through the Bible. So there are a lot of different symbolic systems that are around, but one is visionary and the other is more structural. So that's what's happening at this particular point in time. Welcome, Russ. I haven't seen you in a long time. So here we go. So we first see that the Merkava in Ezekiel in what we call the vision of the divine chariot. There we read, I looked and behold, a storm wind was coming from the north, and the fire was something like the glowing metal and above the firmament. And the throne was, well, the figure of which was the human appearance of a man. Now, there he sees this divine throne, this chariot that's supported by 4 living creatures and wheels within wheels and eyes upon it. All of these various things are all found there. But in Zechariah 6, we don't have all that information. What we have are 4 chariots. And these chariots appeared, well, they emerged, they came out of the 2 mountains. They were drawn by these colorful horses. They are described as the winds and the spirits of heaven, which goes back to where we talked about earlier. They are agents of divine judgment, of power and movement. The chariot represents how God's will is being revealed in this world. In Ezekiel, it's the form through which divine presence becomes visible without fully being seen. But in Zechariah's chariots, well, they symbolize God's active governance in this world, sending force to the 4 corners of creation. Now, the Merkava is the throne of God in motion. Cosmic orders, well, that moves through the spiritual realms. That moves up and down on our ladder. Again, both systems are active. Both systems are active. Now, the wheels within the wheels and the creatures with multiple faces represent layers of spiritual intelligence, angelic forces in perfect harmony with God's will. Now, in Kabbalah, the Merkava is seen as the structure of divine emanation. That's divine emanation, which is the Sephirot that are arranged in a dynamic, well, in a special motion. Again, there's a specific order for these. As you're going through this understanding, well, take a look at 6:5. In chapter 6, verse 5, it says, the angel answered and said to me, these are going out to the four directions of the heavens from standing before the Lord of all the earth. So what's going out? These horses are going out to the four directions. So these riders were given an assignment, a place or direction that they're to go. Now we use the four horses or chariots or winds or whatever you want to use to reflect the idea that this is going to be global in its, well, in this divine action that's about to happen. In Zechariah 2:10, the people are asked are scattered to the four winds of heaven. And this seems to be answered or reversed here in chapter 6, where the four chariots are called and they go out to gather these from the four winds. So why does it matter? Well, the Merkava is not just ancient prophecy. It speaks of how divine presence moves through this world. It's not staticky. In fact, it's dynamic. It speaks of how human consciousness can rise by purification, contemplation, and awe. You and I, we're all trying to get better. We're trying to grow. We see our path of growth coming in many different ways. But the understanding is that we are on that path and it is dynamic. So how our structure works is going to be a little different in each and every one of us, but God is enthroned yet to surround these living origins, these Sephirot, and deal with the mysteries and to protect us. Understand you are under God's protection. The Merkava is a divine chariot. It's symbolic, it's visionary, it's a representation of God's movement in the world. And it speaks of the cosmic and spiritual order and the mystical path of ascent. In Zechariah, it bridges prophecy and apocalyptic actions. God is not distant. He rides forth with purpose, with justice, and with ultimate redemption. Both the Merkava and the Tree of Life shared themes and are structured in such a way that they cover multiple layers. But the fact is, they're both not simply flat, but they're tiered. They're filled with levels. They're filled with forces. Now, both maps are of consciousness and of spiritual architecture. The Merkava has four creatures. It has wheels. It has the throne. In other words, there's specifics to it. In the Tree of Life, there's 10 Sephirot. There's 3 columns. There's 4 worlds. All of that is ordered. There's an organization to everything that's going on. One of the most difficult times I've had is trying to keep track of where I'm at in this world. Where do I fit in? Where am I here? In fact, am I the only one here? And the Merkava mysticism that came out in Jewish understanding early. In fact, it goes all the way back to Abraham. The soul ascends from what's called the Heklot, which is the heavenly palace, which was guarded by angels. And this ascent is dangerous and requires moral purity and knowledge of angelic names. That's what the Merkava deals with. In Kabbalah, the soul tries to climb a tree, aligning itself with different higher Sephiroth. Now, the goal is to reach the top, to reach Keter. And the closest aspect, or the closest access to the Ein Sof, is through the center column, dealing with Malkut and dealing with Tefret. That's where it's the simplest. But you and I, well, we have problems. We're either more male or we're more female. And we find ourselves sliding to the side columns and making it a little harder. That's why we go and constantly learn, so that we learn the feminine aspects and we learn the masculine aspects. We grow and we grow and we grow. Now, I don't want to take this forever, but again, look at I saw a man riding a red horse. Now behind him were red, sorrel, dappled, and white horses. And they were sent to walk throughout the land or throughout the earth. And we went through all of the colors and all of those other things. And in the course of the time, these were scouts. So there was a period of time when peace was here. And so the messengers walked through the land, examining what was going on. And then finally, peace was broken, and Jerusalem became a broken city. This implies that peace, well, there's a call that hides injustice, or a calm that hides injustice that will soon fall. We will soon pass through that. Now, in later Jewish mysticism and Hasidut, the colored horses and divine chariot forces of Zechariah are not only preserved, they are transformed into tools for understanding psychological issues, cosmic processes. There will come a time when you and I will understand a great deal about the more human mind, about how the construction of the world took place, about the divine services that were established long ago. Now, in the Zohar, colors are always going to correspond to specific aspects of the divine soul, of the Sephiroth, of they're just channels of light. White is Hesed, it's loving kindness, it's the right hand of God. Red is the opposite, it's judgment, it's justice, it's the left hand of God. The black is Binah and Malkut, because they're concealed, they're hiding their form. The dapple, on the other hand, is Tefret and Yesod. It's a blending of light and shadows. The Zohar teaches that the horses are the colors of the garments of the divine presence, appearing differently depending on how she reflects her Sephirotic image. Understand, color is nothing more than the idea of sound. It's the idea of volume, vibration. It's the idea of looking at things from a specific point of view that's almost more like looking through refracted light. It's a modality of looking at things. The Ari taught a system. Now, he was obsessed with balance, just like the horses. If these forces are not properly directed, chaos results. Now, the Hasidic masters of it, especially this Baal Shem Tov and his spiritual heirs, internalize these cosmic visions. And the horses now represent inner forces of the soul. The white horse represents the impulse to give, to love, to transcend. The red horse is for fire. It's your boundaries, or lack thereof. It's your lack of discipline. Black, on the other hand, is about the confusion that goes on in this world, the darkness and the concealment. And the dapple, well, that's that idea of the feeling of joy and at the same time fear and the hope of breaking through. We're reaching a point now in our stories that we're coming towards the end of towards the chapters that most everybody reads, the last 4 chapters. But understand it's a process to get to those chapters, that you and I will be growing towards that point. We're making ourselves ready. We're putting ourselves in a position to be better and to do better. I think I'm done for tonight. I hope you had a couple things thought through.